Ethan Walker was 36 years old when life finally forced him to stop pretending he had everything under control. On the outside, he looked like a man who had succeeded in every way that mattered. He wore clean suits, spoke confidently in meetings, and drove a car that made strangers assume he was important. But inside, he was carrying something far heavier than success could ever balance. His life had slowly become a routine of waking up, working, sleeping, and repeating, until even his own reflection in the mirror started to feel like a stranger he barely recognized. It hadn't always been this way. Years ago, Ethan had been full of ambition that felt almost unstoppable. He believed that if he worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, and stayed focused long enough, life would reward him with happiness. But somewhere along the way, the sacrifices stopped feeling temporary. He missed birthdays that he promised he would attend later. He ignored calls from people who once meant everything to him. He told himself it was all for the future he was building, but the future kept moving further away, like a horizon he could never reach. The turning point came quietly, without warning. It was not a dramatic collapse or a sudden disaster. It was a simple evening when Ethan returned to his apartment and realized there was nothing waiting for him except silence. No messages, no warm dinner, no laughter, no reason to feel rushed. Just a stillness that pressed against him in a way he had never felt before. For the first time in years, he didn't reach for his phone or turn on the television. He just sat down, fully aware that something in his life was deeply off balance. That same night, an old envelope slipped out from a drawer he hadn't opened in years. It was slightly yellowed at the edges, sealed but never forgotten. Inside were letters from his younger sister, the one he hadn't spoken to in almost 5 years after a misunderstanding that neither of them had tried hard enough to fix. Her handwriting was familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. She had written about small things, family dinners, their mother's health, memories from childhood, but between the lines there was something heavier. A distance that had grown silently because neither of them had chosen to close it. Ethan didn't sleep that night. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about deadlines or work pressure. He was thinking about time itself, how it had passed without asking permission, how it had taken more than he realized, and how little of it he had used in ways that actually mattered. The realization didn't come with easy answers. It came with discomfort, the kind that forces a person to finally see what they've been avoiding. By morning, Ethan made a decision that surprised even himself. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he knew he couldn't keep living the same way. He packed a small bag, left a short message at work saying he needed time away, and stepped outside into a world that suddenly felt unfamiliar again. For the first time in years, he wasn't running toward anything. He was simply moving, unsure of where life would take him next. And that was where everything began to change. Ethan's journey began with a road he hadn't driven in years, yet every turn felt strangely familiar, as if the landscape itself remembered him, even if he had tried to forget it. The city faded behind him, replaced by long stretches of highway bordered by uneven fields and small clusters of trees that swayed gently in the wind. As the distance grew, so did the feeling that he was leaving behind not just a place, but an entire version of himself. He was heading back to his hometown, Riverton, a quiet place that once felt too small for his dreams. It was the place he had promised himself he would escape from, believing that success meant distance. Now, years later, it was the only place that felt like it might still hold answers he didn't know how to find anywhere else. When Ethan finally crossed the old town sign, something inside him tightened. Riverton hadn't changed much. The same worn-out roads, the same small shops with fading paint, the same slow rhythm of life that once frustrated him now felt almost comforting. Children rode bicycles near sidewalks cracked by time. An old bakery still released warm scents into the morning air, and the local clock tower still stood stubbornly in the center of town, ticking away as if nothing in the world had ever gone wrong. He drove slowly, almost unwillingly, until he reached the street he once called home. The house looked smaller than he remembered. Not physically smaller, but emotionally distant, like something viewed through a glass he could not touch. The paint was slightly faded, and the garden his mother once cared for had grown uneven, as if time had quietly taken over what love used to maintain. Before he could fully gather himself, the front door opened. His mother stood there. For a moment, neither of them moved. She looked older than he remembered, though he knew part of that was his own guilt shaping perception. Her eyes carried surprise, but also something deeper, an emotion that had waited too long to be expressed fully. Ethan suddenly realized how much time he had lost without noticing it slip away. "Ethan," her voice was soft, uncertain, like she wasn't sure whether she was dreaming or truly seeing him. That single word broke something inside him. He stepped forward slowly, and before he could say anything rehearsed or careful, she pulled him into a hug. It wasn't dramatic or emotional in an overwhelming way. It was quiet, but it carried years of absence, misunderstandings, and unanswered questions. Ethan stood still for a moment before finally letting himself return the embrace, realizing how rare it was for him to feel something so real without conditions attached. Inside the house, everything looked both familiar and distant. The same wooden furniture, the same faint scent of old books and tea, the same framed photographs on the wall capturing moments he had once been part of but had since drifted away from. His mother moved around the kitchen as if trying to make sense of his sudden presence, asking small questions, not demanding explanations yet, but clearly holding back emotions she wasn't ready to release all at once. Later that evening, Ethan finally saw his sister. Lee stood in the hallway, hesitant, her arms crossed as if protecting herself from a conversation she had avoided for years. She looked at him not with anger, but with something more complicated, hurt mixed with caution, like someone unsure whether reopening a closed door would bring healing or more damage. "You're back," she said simply, though her tone made it clear that the word back carried more weight than geography. Ethan nodded but couldn't find the right words immediately. For years, he had spoken confidently in boardrooms, negotiations, and presentations. Yet now, in front of his own sister, language felt fragile. "I didn't plan it this way," he finally said. Lee gave a small, almost bitter smile. "Nobody ever does. People just disappear and call it planning." Silence settled between them, heavy but honest. Ethan felt every missed call, every ignored message, every holiday he had promised to attend but never did. He realized that success had not only taken his time, it had trained him to believe that everything could be postponed, including relationships. "I read your letters," he said quietly. That stopped her from turning away. For a moment her expression softened, not completely, but enough to show that something inside her still remembered who he used to be. "I stopped sending them after a while," she admitted. "It started feeling pointless. Like writing to someone who had already decided not to hear me." Those words stayed in the air longer than either of them expected. Ethan didn't defend himself. For the first time, he didn't try to explain, justify, or reframe his choices. Instead, he simply accepted the weight of what she said. That silence became the beginning of something new, not forgiveness yet, but acknowledgement. Over the next few days, Ethan stayed in Riverton. At first, he told himself it was temporary, just a pause before returning to his life. But the longer he stayed, the more he began to notice things he had once overlooked completely. The way his mother quietly struggled with small tasks without asking for help. The way Lee still carried responsibilities he had abandoned without realizing their weight. The way neighbors remembered him not as the successful man he had become elsewhere, but as the boy who once helped carry groceries or fixed broken fences without expecting anything in return. One afternoon, Ethan walked alone near the old riverbank outside town. The water moved slowly, reflecting the sky like a memory that refused to disappear. He sat down on a worn wooden bench, letting the silence surround him. That was when he met an old man sitting nearby. The man looked unremarkable at first, simple clothes, calm posture, eyes that had clearly seen more years than they could easily explain. He greeted Ethan without curiosity or judgment, as if they had known each other for longer than they actually had. "You look like someone who's running from something," the old man said gently. Ethan almost laughed but didn't. "I think I already ran for too long. I'm not sure what I'm doing anymore." The old man nodded slowly, as if he understood that feeling deeply. Most people think life is about reaching somewhere, but sometimes it's about realizing what you left behind while you were trying to get there. Ethan stared at the river, letting the words settle. "I thought I was building something important," he said after a while. "I thought I was doing what I was supposed to do." "And now?" the old man asked. Ethan hesitated. For the first time, he allowed himself to answer honestly. "Now I think I confused movement with meaning." The old man smiled faintly, not in judgment but recognition. That's a lesson many people only understand when they finally stop moving. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of flowing water filling the space between thoughts. Ethan didn't realize it then, but that moment would become a quiet turning point, not because everything changed instantly, but because for the first time, he had started asking different questions. Not how do I succeed, but what is worth holding on to? And that shift, small as it seemed, was the beginning of everything that would come next. The days that followed began to blur into a rhythm Ethan could not have imagined when he first arrived back in Riverton. Time in the city had always felt sharp and segmented, meetings, deadlines, alerts, plans, but here, it stretched and softened, as if life itself was no longer rushing to be somewhere else. At first, that slowness made him uneasy. He kept reaching for his phone out of habit, expecting urgency that never came, expecting demands that no longer existed in the same way. Slowly, though, that discomfort began to shift into something else: awareness. He started noticing details he used to walk past without thought: the way morning sunlight fell unevenly across the old rooftops, the sound of distant laughter from schoolchildren echoing through narrow streets, the small routines of neighbors greeting each other without hurry. These things had always existed, but Ethan had once lived too fast to see them. Now they felt like fragments of a life he had been excluded from, not because it was taken from him, but because he had chosen to step away from it. At home, things with his sister Lee remained careful, like walking across fragile ground. They spoke, but not deeply at first. Their conversations were practical, centered around daily tasks, meals, or updates about their mother. There was a shared understanding that too much too soon could break what little stability had formed between them. Yet beneath that restraint, something quieter was happening. Neither of them was leaving the room as quickly anymore. Neither of them was pretending the past did not exist. One evening, while their mother rested, Ethan found Lee sitting alone on the porch steps. The sky was dimming into soft shades of orange and gray, and the air carried the faint smell of rain that hadn't yet arrived. He hesitated for a moment before sitting a few steps away, giving her space but choosing not to leave. For a while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't hostile anymore, but it wasn't comfortable either. It was simply honest. "You don't have to stay here just because you feel guilty," Lee said finally, still looking forward. Ethan exhaled slowly. "I'm not sure it's guilt anymore, at least not only that." She turned her head slightly, studying him. "Then what is it?" He struggled to find the right words, realizing how unfamiliar honesty had become in his own voice. "I think I spent so long trying to build a life that looked right from the outside that I never stopped to ask if it felt right on the inside." Lee let that sit between them. The wind moved gently through the yard, rustling the edge of the old wooden fence. "You know what hurt the most," she said after a while, her voice quieter now. "It wasn't that you left. People leave for work, for life, for ambition. I understand that more than you think. It was that you stopped coming back emotionally before you stopped coming back physically." Ethan looked down, absorbing the truth in her words without interruption. "It felt like you were slowly erasing us from your life," she continued. "Like we became something you used to be part of instead of something you were still part of." That sentence stayed with him longer than anything else she had said before. For years, Ethan had believed distance was only physical, that as long as he called occasionally, sent messages, or provided support when needed, the connection still existed. But now he understood something deeper and more uncomfortable. Presence is not measured in effort alone, but in consistency of care. "I didn't realize I was doing that," he said quietly. "I know," Lee replied, not sharply but with tired honesty. "That's why it's so complicated." A long silence followed, not empty this time, but full of things neither of them yet knew how to express fully. Over the next few days, Ethan began helping around the house without being asked. At first, it was small things: fixing a broken cabinet door, repairing a leaking tap, helping his mother carry groceries. These tasks should have felt insignificant compared to the life he had once lived, but strangely, they didn't. There was something grounding about them, something that required presence rather than performance. His mother noticed the change but didn't comment on it directly. Instead, she observed him quietly, the way mothers often do when they are trying to understand whether hope is returning or simply passing through temporarily. One afternoon, while sorting through old storage boxes, Ethan found something that made him stop. It was a stack of school notebooks and drawings from his younger years. Pages filled with dreams that once felt limitless, plans of building things, traveling, becoming successful, though at the time he had not defined what that truly meant. One page stood out more than the rest. It was a simple drawing of a house, a tree, and 3 stick figures standing together. Underneath it, in uneven handwriting, he had written, "A life where we are always together." He sat with that page for a long time. It wasn't that his childhood dreams were naive, it was that they were clear. Somewhere along the way, clarity had been replaced by complexity, and complexity had slowly turned into distance. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He walked outside quietly, the house behind him dark and still. The town was asleep, but the world didn't feel empty. It felt reflective, as if everything was waiting for him to understand something he had been avoiding for years. He found himself walking again to the riverbank, where he had first met the old man days earlier. The bench was empty at first, and he wondered if that moment had only existed for him when he needed it most. But after a few minutes, the old man appeared again, as if he had always been part of that place. "You're still here," the man said calmly, sitting beside him. Ethan gave a faint smile. "I guess I keep coming back here without knowing why." "Most people come to places like this when their mind becomes too loud," the man replied. Ethan looked at the water. I think I spent years building a life I thought would make me feel complete, but now I'm realizing I built it in a direction that kept removing the things that actually mattered to me." The old man nodded slowly. "That's not uncommon. People often mistake achievement for fulfillment, but achievement only tells you what you did. It doesn't tell you who you became while doing it." Ethan absorbed that in silence. "I don't know how to fix what I've damaged," he admitted finally. The old man didn't rush to respond. He watched the river as if the answer was already flowing there. "Not everything is meant to be fixed all at once," he said. "Some things are rebuilt slowly through consistency. Not grand gestures, not sudden apologies, just showing up differently than before, long enough for trust to recognize the change." Ethan frowned slightly. "And if it's too late?" The old man turned to him, not with pity, but with calm certainty. "Too late is often just another way of saying you're afraid to start." Those words didn't erase Ethan's uncertainty, but they shifted something inside it. For the first time, he began to see that regret was not a place to live in. It was a signal pointing toward action, even if that action was small. When he returned home that night, he didn't speak much, but something in him had changed in a way that wasn't immediately visible. The following morning, he did not reach for his phone first. Instead, he helped his mother prepare breakfast. Later, when Lee entered the kitchen, he didn't wait for the usual distance between them to form. He simply asked her if she wanted tea. It was a small moment, almost unnoticeable, but Lee paused before answering. And in that pause, something subtle shifted. Not forgiveness yet, not healing yet, but the beginning of recognition that he was no longer only the person who had left. He was also the person who was trying to return. The shift between Ethan and Lee did not happen all at once, nor did it follow any clear path. It moved in quiet, almost invisible ways, through small actions, brief conversations, and moments that would have once passed unnoticed. Trust, Ethan was beginning to understand, did not return because someone asked for it. It returned slowly, carefully, only when it felt safe enough to do so. One morning, Lee asked him to come with her into town. It wasn't an invitation filled with warmth, but it wasn't distant either. It felt neutral, and for Ethan, that alone meant something had changed. They walked side by side through the familiar streets, the silence between them no longer sharp but still uncertain. Lee stopped in front of a small bookstore near the center of Riverton. The place looked old, its wooden signs slightly faded, the windows filled with books stacked in uneven displays. Ethan remembered it vaguely from years ago, though he had never paid much attention to it back then. "I come here sometimes," Lee said, pushing the door open. Inside, the air smelled like paper and time. Rows of books stretched across narrow aisles, and a quiet calm filled the space. An elderly man behind the counter greeted Lee with a nod, clearly recognizing her as a regular. Ethan followed her through the aisles, watching as she ran her fingers lightly across the spines of books, as if each one held a piece of something she was still searching for. "You always liked places like this?" Ethan asked. Lee gave a small shrug. "I think I started coming here after you left." That answer carried more meaning than the words themselves. They wandered in silence for a while until Lee picked up a book and handed it to him. "You used to write," she said. "You remember that." Ethan looked at the book in his hands, caught off guard. It wasn't something he had thought about in years. Writing had once been a part of him, something he did not for success, but because it helped him understand himself. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped. "I didn't have time," he said automatically. Lee looked at him not harshly, but with a kind of quiet clarity. "Or you didn't make time." The question stayed with him long after they left the bookstore. Later that afternoon, Ethan found himself sitting alone in his old room, turning that thought over in his mind. There had always been time. He had simply chosen where to spend it. And most of those choices had been driven by urgency rather than importance. As the days passed, Ethan continued to show up in small ways. He helped Lee with errands, listened when she spoke, and didn't try to rush conversations into something deeper before they were ready. Slowly, she began to respond differently. Her tone softened, her defenses lowered just enough to allow something more genuine to form between them. But healing is rarely linear. One evening, while going through old documents in the living room, Ethan came across a folder he didn't recognize. Inside were medical bills, some recent, some older, all neatly organized. His chest tightened as he flipped through them, realizing that his mother had been dealing with health issues he knew nothing about. "Lay," he called out, his voice tense. She walked in, immediately noticing the papers in his hands. Her expression changed, not into anger, but into something heavier. "You didn't tell me," Ethan said, struggling to keep his voice steady. Lee crossed her arms, not defensively this time, but as if bracing herself. "When exactly was I supposed to tell you? Between the times you didn't answer calls, or the times you said you were too busy to talk?" The words hit harder than he expected, not because they were new, but because they were undeniable. "I would have helped," he said, though even as he spoke, he realized how hollow it sounded. Lee shook her head slightly. Helping isn't just about money or showing up when things get serious. It's about being present before things fall apart. Ethan looked down at the papers, feeling the weight of everything he had missed. Not just events, but moments that mattered in ways he had never measured before. "Why didn't you tell me anyway?" he asked quietly. Lee's voice softened, but only slightly. "Because after a while you stop expecting someone to show up, and when you stop expecting, you stop asking." That truth settled deeply within him. For years, Ethan had believed that he could return at any time and pick up where things left off. But now, he was beginning to understand that absence changes relationships in ways that cannot simply be undone by intention. That night, he couldn't bring himself to say much more. He helped organize the papers, asked practical questions, and made sure his mother had everything she needed. But internally, something had shifted again, this time more sharply. The next morning, he went back to the river. The old man was already there, as if he had been waiting. "You look like you've seen something you can't unsee," the man said calmly. Ethan sat down heavily. "I thought I understood what I had missed, but I didn't, not really." The old man nodded. Understanding often comes in layers. The deeper ones are never comfortable. Ethan stared at the water, his voice quieter now. "I always thought I could fix things later, that there would always be time, but I wasn't just absent. I made them feel like they didn't matter enough to be part of my life." The old man didn't interrupt. "I don't know how to make up for that," Ethan continued. "It feels like anything I do now is too small compared to what I should have done before." The man smiled faintly, though there was no amusement in it, only patience. "You're still thinking in terms of balance, as if you can measure the past and compensate for it." Ethan frowned. "Then what am I supposed to do?" The old man turned slightly toward him. "You don't make up for the past. You honor it by changing how you live now, not to erase what happened, but to ensure it doesn't repeat." Ethan sat with that, letting it sink in slowly. "Regret is only useful if it teaches you something," the man continued. "Otherwise, it becomes a place where people get stuck, reliving what they cannot change instead of acting on what they still can." Ethan exhaled deeply, feeling the truth of those words settle into something more solid than doubt. When he returned home that day, he didn't try to fix everything with words. Instead, he sat with Leigh and asked her to explain everything about their mother's condition. Every detail, every concern, every responsibility she had been carrying alone. Leigh hesitated at first, as if unsure whether this was temporary concern or something more real. But as Ethan listened, truly listened, without interruption or distraction, something began to shift again. This time, it wasn't just about showing up. It was about staying. And for the first time in years, Leigh allowed herself to believe, even if only slightly, that maybe he wasn't going to disappear again. That maybe this version of Ethan, the one who listened, who stayed, who chose presence over distance, was not temporary. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something just as important. The beginning of trust returning, not because of promises, but because of consistent truth in action. The change inside Ethan was no longer subtle. It was becoming something that demanded decisions. For days, he had managed to exist between two worlds, the life he had built in the city and the one he had left behind in Riverton. But now that balance was beginning to feel impossible to maintain. The longer he stayed, the more distant his old life seemed. And the more he reconnected with his family, the more he realized that returning to his old routine would not simply mean going back to work. It would mean stepping away from something he had just begun to rebuild. The question he had been avoiding was no longer quiet. What kind of life was he willing to live now? One morning, Ethan finally turned his phone back on after days of silence. The screen flooded with notifications, missed calls, urgent emails, messages marked important. His chest tightened, not with excitement, but with a familiar pressure he now recognized more clearly than ever. It wasn't responsibility alone. It was expectation, obligation, and a version of himself he wasn't sure he could return to. Among the notifications was a message from his business partner, Daniel. "Ethan, this can't wait anymore. We need you back. Call me." He stared at it for a long time before pressing the call button. Daniel answered almost immediately. "Where have you been? Do you have any idea what's been happening here?" Ethan closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. "I needed time." "Time," Daniel repeated, frustration evident in his voice. "We're in the middle of a major deal. You don't just disappear when things get critical." Ethan had expected this reaction. It wasn't unreasonable. It was the same mindset he had lived by for years, but now, hearing it from the outside, it felt different. "I know," Ethan said calmly, "and I'm not ignoring that. but I also can't pretend that everything is fine and just jump back in like nothing's changed. There was a pause on the other end. "What are you saying?" Daniel asked, his tone shifting slightly. Ethan looked around the room, the same house that held pieces of his past, his mistakes, and now, unexpectedly, his chance to change something. "I'm saying I don't know if I can come back the same way I left," he replied. Silence followed, heavier this time. "Ethan," Daniel said carefully, "you've worked your entire life to get here. You don't just walk away from something like this because you're, tired, confused." Ethan almost responded the way he would have before, defensive, logical, focused on explaining, but he stopped himself. "It's not about being tired," he said quietly. "It's about realizing I built something that cost more than I understood at the time." Daniel exhaled sharply. Everything costs something, that's how life works. Ethan nodded even though Daniel couldn't see him. Yes, but not everything is worth the cost. That sentence lingered in the air between them. "You're making a mistake," Daniel said after a moment. "You'll regret this." Ethan didn't argue, he didn't try to convince him otherwise. Instead, he simply said, "Maybe, but I already regret the things I didn't realize I was losing." After the call ended, Ethan sat in silence, feeling both lighter and more uncertain than before. He hadn't made a final decision yet, but for the first time, he had allowed himself to question something he once believed was unquestionable. That afternoon, he went back to the river. The old man was there again, as if time moved differently for him. "You've reached a crossroads," the man said without needing explanation. Ethan gave a small, tired smile. "Is it always this obvious?" "To those who have stood there before," the man replied. Ethan sat down, staring at the water. "I don't know what the right choice is. If I leave everything behind, I lose what I built. If I go back, I risk losing what I just started to rebuild." The old man nodded slowly. "You're looking for a choice without loss. That rarely exists." Ethan frowned slightly. "So no matter what I choose, I lose something." "Yes," the man said calmly, "but the real question is, what loss can you live with?" That question settled deeply. Ethan thought about his career, the years of effort, the sacrifices, the identity he had built around success. Then he thought about his family, the distance, the missed moments, the quiet pain he was only now beginning to understand. "For a long time," Ethan said slowly, "I chose the kind of loss that didn't feel immediate. I told myself I would deal with it later." "And now?" the old man asked. Ethan looked up, his expression clearer than before. "Now I see that later doesn't come back, it just becomes regret." The old man smiled faintly. "Then you're closer to your answer than you think." That evening, Ethan returned home with a different kind of clarity. Not complete, not perfect, but strong enough to act on. He found Lei in the kitchen, preparing dinner. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked at him, sensing the weight in his voice. "What is it?" He took a moment before speaking. "I don't know exactly what I'm going to do yet, but I do know this: I'm not going back to the way things were." Lei studied him carefully, as if trying to determine whether this was another temporary moment or something real. "I'm not saying I'll stay here forever," he continued. "But wherever I go, whatever I do next, it won't come at the cost of losing this again." There was a long pause. Lei didn't respond immediately, but something in her expression softened, not fully, not completely, but enough to show that his words had reached her in a way that past promises never had. "Just don't disappear again," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "I won't." And this time he didn't say it as a promise meant to comfort. He said it as a decision he was ready to live by. That night, as he lay awake, Ethan realized something important. For years, he had believed that life was about building something stable, something secure, something impressive. But now he was beginning to understand that stability without meaning is just another form of emptiness. The real challenge wasn't choosing between success and family. It was learning how to define success in a way that didn't require losing the people who made life meaningful in the first place. And that realization, the shift from chasing achievement to understanding value, was not just a change in direction. It was the beginning of a completely different way of living. The next morning carried a different kind of weight. It wasn't the heavy confusion Ethan had been living with before, but something sharper, clarity mixed with responsibility. The kind that comes when a decision is no longer just an idea, but something that must be acted upon. He didn't rush out of bed or check his phone immediately. Instead, he sat quietly, letting the stillness settle around him. For the first time in years, he wasn't waking up to react to life, he was waking up to choose it. But choices, he was beginning to understand, don't exist without consequences. By midday, Ethan made the call he had been avoiding, not to Daniel this time, but to the board of the company he had spent years building. It wasn't an easy conversation, nor was it short. Questions came quickly, layered with concern, frustration, and disbelief. To them, Ethan wasn't just an individual, he was a central piece of something much larger. His absence wasn't personal, it was structural. "You're stepping away," one of them asked, unable to hide the sharpness in his tone. "I'm stepping back," Ethan replied carefully, "at least for now." "For now," another voice cut in. "That's not how this works. Either you're in or you're out. This isn't something you pause." Ethan closed his eyes briefly, knowing they were right in a practical sense. The life he had built didn't allow for half measures. "I understand that," he said, "and I'm not asking you to hold things together for me indefinitely. I'm asking for time to figure out how I can continue without repeating the same mistakes." Silence followed, but it wasn't the same silence he had experienced with Lee. This one was colder, more transactional. "You're risking everything," someone finally said. Ethan exhaled slowly. "I know. And if things move on without you," another voice added. "If your position changes, if your role isn't the same when or if you come back." Ethan paused. A few weeks ago, that possibility would have terrified him. It would have felt like losing everything he had worked for. But now, the fear was still there, it just wasn't controlling him the same way. "Then I'll accept that," he said. The meeting ended without resolution, but with an understanding that things had changed. Not just for the company, but for Ethan himself. When he put his phone down, he didn't feel relief. He felt the weight of what he had just done. For the rest of the day, that weight followed him. It was there when he helped his mother with her medication, when he sat quietly during lunch, when he walked through the town that now felt more real than ever before. This wasn't a moment of freedom. It was a moment of transition, and transitions are rarely comfortable. That evening, something unexpected happened. A former colleague, Marcus, showed up in Riverton. Ethan was standing outside when he saw the familiar car pull up. Marcus stepped out, dressed in the same polished, city-ready way Ethan used to be. The contrast between him and the quiet town was almost jarring. "I had to see this for myself," Marcus said as he approached. "I thought Daniel was exaggerating." Ethan gave a faint smile. He usually does, but not this time. Marcus looked around, taking in the surroundings. "So this is where you disappeared to?" "I didn't disappear," Ethan replied. "I came back." Marcus studied him for a moment, then shook his head slightly. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "Yes." There was a pause, followed by a shift in Marcus's tone. Less disbelief now, more curiosity. "Do you even realize what you're walking away from?" he asked. Ethan leaned lightly against the railing, his gaze steady. "I do. The difference is, I also realize what I was walking away from before." Marcus frowned. "That's not the same thing." "No," Ethan agreed, "it's not. That's why I'm making a different choice now." They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them carrying years of shared experience and unspoken understanding. "You used to be the most driven person I knew," Marcus said finally. "Nothing distracted you, nothing pulled you off course." Ethan nodded. "I thought that was strength." "And no." Ethan looked toward the house, where he could see the faint movement of his mother inside, the quiet presence of a life he had once taken for granted. "Now I think it was avoidance," he said. Marcus didn't respond immediately. "You built something incredible," he said after a while. "Not many people get that chance, and even fewer succeed the way you did." "I know," Ethan said, "but I built it in a way that left no room for anything else." Marcus crossed his arms, thinking, "So what's the plan? Stay here forever?" Ethan shook his head slightly. "It's not about where I stay, it's about how I live wherever I am." Marcus let out a short breath, almost a laugh. "That sounds good in theory, but real life isn't that simple." Ethan smiled faintly. "It never was, I just used to pretend it was." The conversation didn't end with agreement. It didn't end with Marcus fully understanding or Ethan fully explaining. But something important happened in that moment. Ethan didn't feel the need to defend his choice the way he once would have. He wasn't trying to convince anyone anymore. For the first time, he was simply living by a decision that made sense to him. After Marcus left, the quiet returned. That night, Ethan went back to the river one more time. The old man was there, as always. "You've taken your first real step," the man said. Ethan sat down, the weight of the day still present but no longer overwhelming. "It doesn't feel like progress. It feels like I just made everything more uncertain." The old man nodded. "That's often what progress feels like in the beginning." Ethan looked at the water, his thoughts slower now, more deliberate. "I thought making the right choice would feel clearer, more certain." "Certainty comes later," the man replied. "First comes the willingness to choose without it." Ethan let that settle. "I might lose everything I built," he said quietly. The old man turned to him. "Or you might build something better. The difference is you're no longer building blindly." Ethan sat in silence, watching the river move steadily forward. For the first time, he wasn't trying to control where things would go. He was learning how to move with intention instead of fear. And that shift, quiet but powerful, was changing everything. The following days unfolded with a quiet steadiness, but beneath that calm, something deeper was building, something Ethan could feel without fully understanding yet. Life in Riverton had begun to feel natural in a way that unsettled him, not because it was wrong, but because it revealed how unnatural his previous life had become. He had started to fall into a rhythm with his family. Mornings were slower, shared over simple breakfasts. Afternoons were spent handling errands, helping around the house, or sitting with his mother as she rested. Evenings carried conversations that, while still careful at times, were becoming more open, more real. There were moments of laughter now, small, unexpected ones that didn't feel forced. But life has a way of reminding people that time is never as generous as they assume. One afternoon, while Ethan was in the backyard repairing part of the old fence, he heard Lee call out his name. There was something in her voice, sharp, urgent, that made him drop everything and rush inside. Their mother was sitting in the living room, but something was wrong. Her breathing was uneven, her face pale in a way that immediately erased any sense of normalcy Ethan had started to believe in. "Mom," he said quickly, kneeling beside her. She tried to respond, but her voice was faint, her words unclear. Lee was already on the phone, speaking quickly, her usual composure replaced by focused urgency. Ethan stayed beside his mother, holding her hand, feeling how fragile it suddenly seemed. In that moment, nothing else existed. Not his career. Not his past decisions. Not his uncertainty about the future. Only this. The ambulance arrived faster than it felt, but the minutes before it came stretched endlessly. Ethan stayed by his mother's side the entire time, speaking softly, even though he wasn't sure she could fully hear him. At the hospital, everything moved quickly. Doctors and nurses took over with practiced efficiency, guiding her away while Ethan and Lee were left standing in a space that felt too still after so much urgency. The waiting began. Hospitals have a way of distorting time. Minutes feel like hours, and thoughts move faster than answers ever do. Ethan sat beside Lee, both of them silent, their shared worry removing any remaining distance between them. For the first time since he had returned, there was no past between them. Only the present. After what felt like an endless stretch, a doctor approached them. His expression was calm but serious. "She's stable," he said, "but this wasn't minor. Her condition has been progressing more than you might have realized." Ethan felt a quiet heaviness settle into his chest. "We'll need to monitor her closely," the doctor continued, "and moving forward she'll require more consistent care." Lee nodded, already processing the practical reality of what that meant. Ethan didn't speak immediately. Not because he didn't understand, but because, for the first time, he truly did. Later that night, after their mother had been moved to a room and things had settled into a fragile stability, Ethan stepped outside the hospital. The air was cool, the world unusually quiet compared to the storm inside him. He sat down on a bench, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped together. For years, he had lived as if time was something he could control, something he could spend now and recover later. But sitting there, with the weight of what had just happened still fresh, he understood something he had only been slowly realizing before. Time doesn't wait for clarity. It moves forward regardless of whether you are ready. Lee joined him a few minutes later, sitting beside him without saying anything at first. "She's going to be okay," she said eventually, though her voice carried both hope and uncertainty. Ethan nodded, "Yeah." There was a pause. "I didn't realize how bad it had gotten," he admitted. Lee didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was softer than it had been in days. "You weren't here to see it change," she said. "It didn't happen all at once, it was gradual." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. That word again. Gradual. Just like distance. Just like regret. Just like the life he had built without noticing what it was costing him. "I should have been here," he said quietly. Lee looked at him, not with accusation this time, but with something closer to understanding. "Maybe," she said, "but you're here now." Ethan turned slightly toward her. "That doesn't erase anything." "No," she agreed, "but it changes what happens next." Those words stayed with him. Not everything could be undone, not every moment could be recovered, but the future, however uncertain, was still something he could choose to shape. That night, Ethan didn't leave the hospital. He stayed in the chair beside his mother's bed, watching over her as she slept. The room was quiet, filled only with the soft rhythm of machines and the steady rise and fall of her breathing. At some point, she stirred slightly, her eyes opening just enough to recognize him. "Ethan," she whispered. "I'm here," he said immediately, leaning closer. She looked at him for a moment as if trying to make sure he was really there. Then, with a faint, tired smile, she said something that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. "You came back." It wasn't a question. It was a realization. And in those 3 words there was no blame, no regret, only quiet acknowledgement. Ethan felt something shift inside him in a way that was deeper than anything before. "I'm not leaving," he said softly. She didn't respond with words. She simply closed her eyes again, her hand resting lightly in his. But that moment said everything. For years, Ethan had believed that big decisions defined life, the major moves, the visible successes, the milestones that others could see. But now, sitting in that quiet hospital room, he understood something far more important. Life is defined by the moments you choose to be present when it matters most. Not later, not eventually, but now. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan wasn't thinking about what he might lose by staying. He was thinking about what he would lose if he didn't. The days after the hospital visit did not return to normal, because normal no longer existed in the way it once had. Instead, life reshaped itself around a new reality, one that required attention, patience, and a kind of presence Ethan had never truly practiced before. Their mother was discharged a few days later, but the doctor's words remained clear. This was not something that would simply pass. It would require ongoing care, consistency, and awareness. It was no longer about reacting to emergencies. It was about preventing them. Back at home, everything felt slightly different. The same walls, the same furniture, the same routines, but now each action carried a deeper awareness. Lee adjusted quickly, as she always had, stepping into responsibility with quiet strength. But this time, she wasn't alone. Ethan didn't wait to be asked. He took initiative in ways that were new not only to Lee, but to himself. He learned about medications, schedules, symptoms, and small warning signs. He asked questions, made notes, and paid attention to details he would have once considered insignificant. At first, it felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. He wasn't used to this kind of responsibility, not because it was difficult, but because it required a different kind of focus. There were no deadlines, no measurable achievements, no external validation, just consistency. And consistency, he realized, was something he had underestimated his entire life. One afternoon, while organizing a small table near the living room, Ethan found an old clock that had stopped working. It was simple, slightly worn, and clearly untouched for years. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "Why didn't anyone fix this?" he asked casually. Lee glanced at it. "It broke a long time ago. We just stopped noticing it after a while." Ethan stared at the clock for a moment longer. Stopped noticing. The phrase stayed with him. That evening he sat down at the table with a few tools, carefully opening the back of the clock. It wasn't something he had done before, but he worked patiently, slowly understanding how the pieces fit together. It took time, more than he expected, but eventually, after adjusting a few parts and replacing a small battery, the clock ticked again. The sound was soft, almost insignificant, but it filled the room in a way that felt symbolic. Lee looked over, surprised. "You fixed it." Ethan smiled faintly. "It just needed attention." She didn't respond immediately, but something in her expression shifted. Because they both understood that he wasn't just talking about the clock. That night, Ethan sat outside alone, the quiet of Riverton surrounding him. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what he needed to achieve next. He wasn't planning, calculating, or anticipating. He was reflecting. He thought about everything that had changed in such a short time. His career, his identity, his understanding of success. For so long, he had believed that purpose came from building something big, something visible, something that others could recognize. But now his days were filled with smaller things. Helping his mother walk carefully across the room. Making sure she took her medication on time. Sitting with Lai and listening without trying to fix everything. Repairing what had been quietly neglected. None of these things would ever appear impressive to the outside world. But for the first time, they felt meaningful in a way his previous achievements never had. The next morning, Ethan went back to the river. The old man was there, as if the place itself held him. "You're starting to understand something," the man said without looking at him. Ethan sat down, a quiet sense of calm in his expression. "I think I spent most of my life chasing purpose in the wrong places." The old man nodded slightly. "And where are you finding it now?" Ethan thought for a moment before answering. "In the things I used to overlook," he said. "In showing up, in paying attention, in being there when it matters, even if no one else sees it." The old man smiled faintly. Purpose is rarely found in what impresses others. It's found in what remains meaningful even when no one is watching. Ethan let that settle. I used to think purpose had to be something big, he admitted. Something that proved I was doing something important with my life. And now, the old man asked. Ethan looked out at the river, his voice steady. Now I think purpose is built through consistency, through small actions repeated over time, through being present in ways that actually matter. The old man nodded. That's a lesson many people spend their entire lives avoiding. Ethan gave a small, thoughtful smile. I think I was one of them. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the river steady and grounding. There's something else, Ethan said after a moment. I don't know what comes next. I've stepped away from my old life, but I haven't built a new one yet. The old man looked at him calmly. That space in between is where real change happens. It feels uncertain, Ethan admitted. It is, the man replied. But uncertainty is not the same as being lost. Sometimes it simply means you're no longer following a path that wasn't right for you. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling a sense of acceptance settle in. For the first time, he wasn't trying to rush toward an answer. He was allowing himself to exist in the question. When he returned home that day, something had shifted again, not dramatically, but deeply. He moved through the house with a sense of quiet intention, aware of the impact of even the smallest actions. Later that evening, as he sat with Lei and their mother, sharing a simple meal, he realized something he hadn't expected. He wasn't thinking about what he had given up anymore. He was thinking about what he had gained. Time, connection, present, meaning, things he once believed he would get to later. And in that realization, another truth became clear, one that would shape everything moving forward. A meaningful life is not built by what you achieve. It is built by what you choose to care about, consistently, every single day. The quiet rhythm Ethan had begun to build did not last untouched. Life, as he was learning, does not test people once and then leave them in peace. It circles back, often at the moment when you begin to feel steady, and asks a simple but difficult question. Are you truly changed or just comfortable? The test came in a way Ethan had not expected. One afternoon, while he was reviewing his mother's medication schedule, his phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Daniel or Marcus. It was one of the senior board members. Ethan hesitated before answering, already sensing that this call would not be simple. We need to talk, the voice said firmly. This situation can't remain unresolved. Ethan stepped outside, the familiar weight returning, though it felt different now, less controlling but still present. I understand, he said. There was no delay, we've been patient, but the company is moving forward. There's a position opening at the executive level, one that was always intended for you. If you return now, it's yours. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened slightly. This was not just a request. It was an opportunity, the kind he had worked years to reach. If you don't come back, the voice continued, we'll have to move on without you, and this time there won't be a way to step back in later. You need to decide. The words were clear. No middle ground. No for now. No safety net. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. I'll think about it, he said. You don't have much time, came the reply. This decision will define the direction of your life. Don't take it lightly. The call ended. Ethan stood there, the world around him suddenly quieter, as if everything was waiting for his answer. For a moment, the old thoughts returned. This is everything you worked for. You can't throw it away now. You'll regret this. But alongside those thoughts, something else existed now, something stronger than before. A different question. What kind of life do you actually want? That evening, Ethan didn't say anything to Lee right away. He carried the weight of the decision quietly, trying to understand it fully before speaking it out loud. But Lee noticed. You're somewhere else, she said gently while they sat together. Ethan looked at her, realizing there was no point in hiding it. I got a call, he admitted, from the company. Lee's expression shifted slightly, not with surprise but with recognition. She had known this moment would come eventually. They want you back, she said. Ethan nodded, not just back. They're offering me the position I've been working toward for years. Lee didn't respond immediately. She looked down at her hands, then back at him. That's a big opportunity, she said carefully. It is, Ethan agreed. There was a pause. You should take it, she added quietly. Ethan frowned slightly, caught off guard. You think so? Lee gave a small, conflicted smile. I think it's your life, and I don't want to be the reason you walk away from something important. Ethan studied her expression, seeing the honesty in it, but also something else. Fear. Not fear of his success, but fear of being left behind again. That's not what this is about, he said. "I know," she replied quickly, "but it still matters." The room fell into silence. For the first time since his return, Ethan felt the full weight of both paths in front of him, not as abstract ideas, but as real, unavoidable choices. Later that night, he went back to the river. The old man was there, as if this place existed outside of time. "You've been offered something difficult to refuse," the man said. Ethan sat down slowly. "How do you know?" The old man smiled faintly, "Because that's usually when people come here the most." Ethan looked out at the water, his thoughts moving carefully. "If I go back," he said, "I get everything I worked for, stability, success, the life I built." "And if you don't?" the man asked. Ethan hesitated. "Then I lose that, but I keep this." He gestured slightly, though the word itself felt too big to define. "Connection," the old man said softly. Ethan nodded. They sat in silence for a moment. "I don't know which one is right," Ethan admitted. The old man turned to him, his expression calm but firm. "You're still thinking there's a right choice that comes without consequence." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Then what am I supposed to base it on?" The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked a question. "When you're older," he said, "and you look back on your life, which regret would be harder to carry?" Ethan felt something shift. Not a solution, but a direction. He closed his eyes for a moment, imagining both futures. One where he returned, regained everything he had built, but slowly drifted away from the life he had just begun to repair. And one where he stayed, or at least chose a different path, where success might look different, uncertain, but aligned with the values he was only now beginning to understand. He opened his eyes. "I think I already know," he said quietly. The old man nodded, as if he had expected that. "Then the decision isn't as complicated as you think," he replied. Ethan sat there a while longer, not rushing, not forcing clarity, but allowing it to settle naturally. When he finally stood up, something inside him felt steady in a way it hadn't before. Not certain of outcomes, but certain of direction. That night he didn't overthink, he didn't rehearse or second guess. He made the call. When Daniel answered, Ethan didn't hesitate. "I'm not coming back," he said. There was silence on the other end. "Are you sure?" Daniel asked, his voice quieter now. Ethan looked up at the night sky, the stillness around him grounding his words. "Yes," he said, "I'm sure." "You're walking away from everything," Daniel said. Ethan shook his head slightly, even though Daniel couldn't see him. "No," he replied, "I'm choosing something else." After the call ended, Ethan stood there for a moment, letting the reality settle in. This time there was no immediate relief. No sense of victory. Just a quiet understanding that his life had changed in a way that could not be reversed. And strangely, that didn't scare him as much as it once would have. Because for the first time, he wasn't choosing based on fear of loss. He was choosing based on understanding of value. And that difference, subtle but powerful, was the clearest sign that he had truly changed. The decision did not arrive with celebration. It arrived quietly, settling into Ethan's life like a new foundation, steady but unfamiliar. The next morning felt different, not because anything around him had changed, but because something within him had. For the first time in years, there was no looming expectation waiting for him on his phone, no invisible pressure pulling him back toward a life he no longer wanted to live. But with that absence came something else. Space. And space, Ethan was beginning to understand, can feel just as overwhelming as pressure if you don't know what to do with it. The first few days after his decision were strangely disorienting. He continued helping at home, caring for his mother, spending time with Lei, but now there was an underlying question that followed him quietly. What comes next? He no longer had a career dictating his direction. No structured goals, no clearly defined path. The life he had stepped away from had given him identity, even if it had cost him everything else. Now he had to rebuild that identity from something deeper, something more honest. One afternoon, while walking through town, Ethan found himself stopping again in front of the small bookstore Lei had taken him to days earlier. This time, he didn't hesitate. He stepped inside. The same quiet atmosphere greeted him, unchanged and grounding. The elderly shopkeeper looked up briefly, nodding in recognition. Ethan wandered slowly through the aisles, not searching for anything specific, just allowing himself to move without urgency. Eventually, he found himself standing in front of a section filled with journals and blank notebooks. He picked one up. Simple, unmarked, empty. For a moment he just held it, feeling the weight of what it represented. Not the past, not expectations. Possibility. That evening he sat alone at the small table in his room, the notebook open in front of him. The blank page felt intimidating in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just paper, it was a reflection of where he stood in life. No clear script. No predefined direction. Just choice. At first, he didn't write anything. He simply sat there, letting his thoughts settle. Then slowly he began. Not with something impressive. Not with something perfect. Just honest. He wrote about the life he had lived, the ambition, the drive, the success. Then he wrote about what it had cost him, the distance, the missed moments, the gradual disconnection. And finally, he wrote about what he was beginning to understand now, the importance of presence, of relationships, of choosing what truly matters before it's too late. The words didn't come easily at first, but once they started, they didn't stop. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't writing to achieve something. He was writing to understand. Days turned into a quiet routine, mornings with his family, afternoons helping around the house or running errands, evenings spent writing, sometimes for hours, sometimes just a few lines. It wasn't about consistency in output. It was about consistency in reflection. One evening, Lee noticed the notebook resting on the table. "You started writing again," she said. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, I didn't plan it, it just felt right." She picked it up, flipping through a few pages before looking at him again. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why now?" Ethan thought for a moment before answering. "Because I finally have something real to say." Lee studied him, then gave a small, genuine smile, the kind he hadn't seen from her in a long time. "You always did," she said. "You just didn't stop long enough to hear it." That night, Ethan went back to the river again. The old man was there, as always, sitting in the same quiet stillness. "You've chosen your path," the man said. Ethan sat beside him, calmer than he had ever been in their previous conversations. "I think I've chosen how I want to live. The path is still forming." The old man nodded. "That's how it should be." Ethan looked out at the water. "I thought once I made the decision, everything would feel clear, but it doesn't, it just feels different." "Clarity doesn't come from a single decision," the old man said. "It comes from living that decision every day." Ethan let that settle. "I don't know where this leads," he admitted. "I don't know if what I'm building now will turn into anything." The old man turned to him, his expression steady. "You're still measuring your life by outcomes." Ethan paused. "Then how should I measure it?" he asked. The old man gave a faint smile. "By alignment." Ethan frowned slightly. "Alignment with what?" "With what you've learned matters," the man replied. "With the values you once ignored, with the kind of person you want to be, not just what you want to achieve." Ethan sat in silence, the word echoing in his mind. Alignment. It wasn't something he had ever considered before. His entire life had been about progress, growth, achievement, but never alignment. "Success without alignment feels empty," the old man continued. "But even a simple life, when it's aligned with what truly matters to you, can feel deeply fulfilling." Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling something settle into place. For years, he had been climbing without asking whether the ladder was leaning against the right wall. Now, for the first time, he was choosing where to place it. When he returned home that night, everything felt quieter, not externally, but internally. The constant noise that had once driven his decisions was fading, replaced by something steadier. In the weeks that followed, Ethan began doing something he never expected. He started sharing his writing. At first, it was small, reading passages to Lei, showing her thoughts he had written late at night. Then slowly he expanded, sharing with a few people in town, leaving copies at the bookstore, allowing his reflections to exist outside of himself. The response wasn't overwhelming, but it was real. People connected with what he wrote, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest, because it spoke to something many of them felt but hadn't put into words. One afternoon, the bookstore owner approached him. "These," he said, holding a few pages Ethan had left behind, "they matter." Ethan looked at him, unsure how to respond. "Not because they're impressive," the man continued, "but because they're true." Ethan felt a quiet shift inside him. For so long he had chased impact through scale, through numbers, through visibility, through success that could be measured. Now he was beginning to see that impact could exist in something much simpler. One person understanding something they hadn't before. One moment of reflection that changes a decision. One honest truth that reaches someone at the right time. That night, as Ethan sat with his notebook again, he realized something that would become the core of everything he had learned. A meaningful life is not something you find. It is something you build through small, consistent choices that align with what truly matters, even when no one is watching, even when the outcome is uncertain. And for the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't trying to rush toward a final destination. He was building something that felt right as he lived it. The months that followed did not transform Ethan's life into something perfect, but they transformed it into something real. Riverton moved through its seasons quietly, almost as if time itself had slowed just enough for people to notice it again. The trees shifted from green to gold, the air grew cooler, and life continued in its steady, unhurried rhythm. But for Ethan, each passing day carried a depth he had never experienced before. His mother's health remained fragile but stable. There were difficult days when her energy faded quickly, when simple tasks became exhausting, but there were also moments of warmth, of laughter, of quiet conversations that carried more meaning than entire years Ethan had once lived through. Lee changed too, though in a way that was less visible from the outside. The guarded distance she once held began to dissolve, replaced by something stronger, not just trust, but partnership. They shared responsibilities now, but more importantly, they shared understanding. And Ethan became someone new without trying to force it. He didn't wake up one day feeling like a different person. Instead, he changed through repetition, through showing up, through choosing presence again and again, through living the lessons he had once only begun to understand. His writing grew as well. What started as private reflections slowly turned into something larger. The small pages he left at the bookstore began to reach more people. Some returned to talk to him. Others simply left notes, short messages expressing how his words had made them think differently, feel differently, or reconnect with something they had almost forgotten. One note stayed with him more than the others. "You wrote something I didn't know I needed to hear." Ethan read that line more than once, because he realized something important in that moment. He hadn't set out to change anyone. He had only set out to understand himself. And somehow that honesty had become meaningful to others. One evening, as the sky dimmed into soft shades of dusk, Ethan walked once more to the river. The familiar path no longer felt like a place of questions. It felt like a place of reflection, a space where everything had quietly come together. The old man was there, as always. But this time something felt different. Ethan sat beside him, not with uncertainty, but with calm. "I think I understand now," Ethan said. The old man glanced at him, a faint smile forming. "Do you?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Not everything, not the future, not every decision, but what matters." The old man waited, letting him continue. "For most of my life," Ethan said, "I thought I had to build something big to make my life meaningful. I thought success would give me that meaning, but I was measuring everything by how it looked, not how it felt." He paused, looking out at the river. "I kept thinking I would find meaning at the end of everything I was building, but meaning isn't something waiting at the finish line. It's something that has to exist along the way." The old man's smile deepened slightly. "Go on." Ethan took a breath. "I've realized that life isn't about avoiding regret completely. That's impossible. It's about choosing the kind of regret you can live with, and more importantly, choosing in a way that you won't have to keep questioning who you are." The river moved steadily beside them, unchanged and constant. "I used to think time was something I could manage," Ethan continued. "Something I could organize, delay, control, but time isn't like that. It moves forward no matter what. And the only real choice we have is how present we are while it does." The old man nodded, his expression calm and approving. "And now?" he asked. Ethan smiled faintly, but it was a different kind of smile, one that didn't come from achievement, but from understanding. "Now I know that a meaningful life isn't built in big moments," he said. "It's built in small ones, in showing up, in paying attention, in choosing people again and again, even when it's inconvenient, even when it doesn't look impressive." He paused for a moment before adding quietly, "And in being honest about what truly matters, before time makes that decision for you." The old man looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "You've learned what many people spend their entire lives avoiding," he said. Ethan let out a slow breath, feeling a sense of peace settle into him. "I wish I had understood this earlier," he admitted. The old man's gaze softened. "Most people do, but understanding it now is what matters." Ethan nodded. For the first time, he didn't feel the weight of the past pressing against him. He felt acceptance. They sat in silence for a while longer, the sound of the river steady and grounding. Eventually, Ethan turned slightly. "Will I see you again?" he asked. The old man smiled, but there was something different in it this time, something quieter, more final. "You won't need to," he said. Ethan frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" The old man stood slowly, his posture calm, his presence as steady as ever. "You were never here to find answers from me," he said. "You were here to remember what you already knew." Ethan watched him, something unspoken settling into the moment. "And now?" Ethan asked. The old man looked at him one last time. "Now you'll carry it with you." And with that, he walked away. Ethan didn't follow. He didn't need to. Because for the first time, he understood that the guidance he had been seeking was no longer outside of him. It was within him. That night, as Ethan walked back home, everything felt different, not because the world had changed, but because he had. The same streets, the same houses, the same quiet town, but now each part of it felt connected to something deeper. When he entered the house, he found Lee sitting with their mother, both of them talking quietly. They looked up as he walked in, and for a moment nothing was said. But everything was understood. Ethan sat down beside them, not thinking about the future, not worrying about what came next. Just present, just there. And in that moment, simple, quiet, unremarkable to anyone else, his life felt complete in a way it never had before. Not because he had achieved everything, but because he had finally understood what was worth holding on to. Final life lesson of the story. A meaningful life is not defined by how much you achieve, how far you go, or how successful you appear to others. It is defined by how present you are in the moments that matter, how honestly you live according to your values, and how consistently you choose what truly matters, before time quietly takes that choice away. Success can build a life that looks complete, but only presence, connection, and alignment can build a life that actually feels complete.